300,000 years ago, Earth was a very different place, and humans weren't alone. Giant animals, some larger than buses, roamed freely across vast lands. Ice sheets covered much of Europe, while deserts and forests stretched farther than they do today. The climate was unstable and always changing. This wasn't a world made for comfort, it was a world made for survival. But what did life really look like back then? How did our ancestors live, adapt, and evolve? And what became of the creatures that once roamed a world so unfamiliar, yet so connected to our own? Let's step back into a time before cities, before memory, and everything hung in the balance. Earth's frozen breath and fiery heart. The world 300,000 years ago was locked in a cycle of extremes, icy cold and sudden warmth, repeated over thousands of years. These weren't random events. Earth's climate was being steered by something called Milankovitch cycles, natural shifts in how the Earth tilts, spins, and orbits the sun. These tiny changes in movement had massive consequences. They decided when glaciers would grow and when they'd retreat. During colder periods known as glacial, temperatures around the globe dropped dramatically. Ice sheets as thick as 2 miles spread across large parts of Europe, Asia, and North America, crushing forests and changing the shape of entire continents. In some places, land that's now underwater was dry and walkable. That's because so much water was frozen into ice that sea levels were up to 100 meters lower than today. Entire coastlines were different, and islands we now know may have been part of the mainland. Then as the Earth shifted again, came the interglacial periods, brief windows of warmth where the ice pulled back, vegetation returned, and animals flourished. Forests would grow, grasslands would stretch, and the land would come back to life, only for the cold to strike again in a repeating loop. But ice wasn't the only force reshaping the planet. Volcanoes were still very active, especially along the edges of tectonic plates, the giant puzzle pieces that make up Earth's surface. Eruptions were frequent, spewing ash into the sky and lava across the ground. These eruptions weren't just violent, they helped form new mountains, valleys, and even islands. Combined with earthquakes and plate movement, this created a constantly changing planet where no landscape stayed the same for long. These powerful forces, ice, heat, and shifting land, had a huge impact on life. Animal species were pushed from one region to another as their habitats froze or dried up. Early humans were forced to move too, following game animals, escaping harsh climates, and searching for better shelter or food. Land bridges like the one that once connected Asia to North America opened up during low sea levels, allowing animals and humans to cross between continents. In short, Earth 300,000 years ago wasn't static. It was pulsing, breathing, expanding, and breaking apart. It was colder, louder, and more unstable, but it was also deeply alive. These shifting climates and moving continents didn't just shape the land. They shaped evolution itself. They carved out the paths animals took. They decided where forests would grow, and they even determined where humans could live and how they'd adapt. The climate didn't just influence history. Back then, it was the history. One of the biggest differences between the Earth of 300,000 years ago and today wasn't something you could see, but something you could breathe. The air back then had much less carbon dioxide, CO2, the gas that plays a major role in trapping heat in the atmosphere. While today's levels sit above 400 parts per million, ppm, back then, they hovered between 200 and 280 ppm. That made for a cooler, drier planet overall, especially during glacial phases when temperatures dropped drastically. These CO2 levels had a direct impact on the planet's ecosystems. When the Earth warmed during interglacial periods, vegetation flourished. Grasses, shrubs, and trees spread across landscapes that had previously been frozen solid. But when the cold returned, much of that greenery died back. What remained was hardy, sparse plant life, tough grasses, mosses, and low shrubs that could survive extreme conditions. Different regions developed their own distinct identities. Africa was rich with savannas, vast open grasslands dotted with waterholes and herds of grazing animals. In the north near the glaciers, tundra and steppe landscapes dominated, cold, treeless, and wind-blasted. Temperate zones like parts of Europe and Asia grew thick forests when the climate allowed, creating shelter for both predators and prey. Despite the challenges, this environment supported a surprising variety of life. Enormous herbivores like mammoths and giant deer coexisted with stealthy predators like saber-toothed cats and massive lions. Scavengers followed behind, cleaning up what was left. Every species had to adapt or vanish. Compared to the rich, relatively stable biomes we know today, the ecosystems of the Middle Pleistocene were unpredictable and unforgiving. But they were also full of life that had learned to bend, not break with the climate. And among those survivors were some very early, very resourceful humans, the focus of our next section. If the climate shaped the land, then megafauna shaped life on it. Megafauna refers to the giant animals that roamed Earth during the Pleistocene. Creatures so massive and strange, they make today's wildlife seem miniature. These weren't fantasy beasts. They were real, they were dominant, and they were everywhere. Let's begin in Africa, where giants walked the open savannas. One of the most iconic was the Paleontologus, sometimes called the prehistoric buffalo. This massive bovid weighed over 2,600 pounds, as heavy as a pickup truck. With horns stretching more than 6 feet across, Paleontologus was both intimidating and majestic. Early humans likely hunted it, but evidence also suggests they may have revered it. In some ancient African cave paintings, horned creatures appear with almost ritualistic attention to detail. Another African heavyweight was Mitridiocorus andrewsi, a giant warthog that looked like something out of a nightmare. Its spiraled, upward curving tusks weren't just for show, they were weapons. This animal was no picky eater either. It was an omnivore, meaning it could feed on anything from roots and fruit to small animals. Its ability to survive harsh, changing environments made it one of the more adaptable species of its time. Then there was Cibotherium, a distant cousin of today's giraffe, but built like a tank. It stood over 7 feet at the shoulder and had not 2, but 4 horn-like structures on its head. Unlike modern giraffes that stretch tall to reach tree canopies, Cibotherium was more compact, stronger, and probably fed on lower branches and tough shrubs. It thrived in savannas and open woodlands, where speed wasn't as important as power and endurance. From Africa, let's travel east, where evolution took a bold turn in the dense forests and mountains of Asia. In Southeast Asia, there lived a creature so massive, so mysterious, it may have inspired legends still whispered today. Meet Gigantopithecus, a giant ape that could grow up to 10 feet tall and weigh over 1,100 pounds. It fed on bamboo, fruits, and roots, much like modern gorillas. Only its jaw bones and teeth have survived, but those fragments are enough to suggest it was the largest primate to ever live. Some even believe it may be behind the myths of the Yeti or Sasquatch, a reminder of how real animals become folklore over time. Not far from Gigantopithecus's habitat roamed one of the greatest predators of the age, Panthera leofossilis, the ancient lion. This lion was even larger than today's African lion and likely more muscular. Fossils found in places like Germany and Italy reveal a creature that could exceed 600 pounds, with paws the size of dinner plates and jaws capable of crushing bone. It was an apex predator, meaning nothing hunted it, except possibly early humans. And speaking of humans, we now head into Europe, where the line between hunter and hunted was often blurred. Europe during the Middle Pleistocene was a cold, wild frontier, and it was home to some unforgettable giants. First, the Megaloceros giganteus, also known as the giant deer. Its antlers alone could span nearly 12 feet, wider than a car. But it wasn't just about looks. These antlers were tools of battle and attraction. Males used them to fight for dominance, much like modern deer. Cave paintings in places like Lascaux show how early humans viewed these animals, possibly with a mix of awe, fear, and respect. Roaming those same frozen landscapes was the Homo, a saber-toothed cat with a deadly twist. Unlike its cousin Smilodon, we'll get to that soon, Homo had shorter, scimitar-shaped teeth designed for slicing rather than stabbing. Its long legs and powerful frame suggest it could run down prey and may have hunted in coordinated packs like wolves. But even the fiercest cats needed to be careful. Europe was also home to the woolly rhinoceros, a massive fur-covered grazer built for the cold. Covered in thick, reddish-brown hair and armed with two horns, it could weigh up to 6,600 pounds, as much as a full-grown elephant today. It used its horns not only to defend itself, but to dig through snow in search of food. Also walking those icy plains was the aurochs, the wild ancestor of domestic cattle. Tall, dark-coated, and fiercely territorial, aurochs were no easy hunt. Early humans painted them on cave walls, likely to honor their power or perhaps to summon courage before the next chase. Crossing the ocean, we enter the wild landscapes of North America. In the arid lands of what is now the American Southwest, the Nothrotheriops, also called the Shasta ground sloth, made its home. Unlike modern sloths that hang in trees, this one walked on the ground and stood upright when needed. It lived in deserts and caves, feeding on dry plants like agave and cacti. How do we know? Fossilized dung, yes, ancient poop, has revealed incredible details about its diet and habits. And though not featured in the original transcript, it's worth mentioning Smilodon, the most famous saber-toothed predator. With dagger-like teeth up to 7 inches long, it hunted large prey in North and South America. Its stocky build suggests it ambushed rather than chased, making it a terror in thick brush or forests. Let's now move further south, where isolation gave rise to evolution's most bizarre creation. Few creatures capture the strangeness of South American wildlife like Macrauchenia. It has a body like a camel, a long giraffe-like neck, and a short trunk on its face. It walked on 3-toed feet and likely used its odd snout to sniff out food or regulate temperature. Scientists puzzled over its ancestry for decades, unsure whether it was closer to horses, camels, or something entirely different. Eventually, genetic studies showed it was a distant relative of horses and rhinos, just one that took a very different path in isolated South America. In South America, where animals evolved without contact from the rest of the world, creatures like Macrauchenia ruled without direct competition from African or Asian megafauna. But on the far edges of the prehistoric world, isolation reached its peak. On the island of Madagascar, one of the most astounding birds ever known walked the earth, the Varambe titan. Its name means big bird in the Malagasy language, and it fits. This flightless giant stood over 10 feet tall and weighed nearly a ton. It fed on fruit, leaves, and low vegetation, and had no natural predators until humans arrived. Sadly, that marked the beginning of its end. Nearby in Oceania, the islands were home to another armored oddity, the Meolania, a giant land turtle covered in thick bony armor and crowned with backward-facing horns. Its tail ended in club-like spikes, making it look more like a dinosaur than a turtle. It wandered forests and coasts, grazing peacefully until its path crossed with human settlers. These were the titans of the past, giants who shaped ecosystems, migrated across continents, and even shared the land with the first humans. Some were hunted, others were worshipped. All of them were extraordinary, but their story isn't complete without the humans who walked beside them. And now let's look at the ones who lived, adapted, and evolved in the shadows of these giants. In the world 300,000 years ago, humans and animals weren't just neighbors, they were competitors, collaborators, and sometimes something more. The line between predator and prey was thin, and early humans were walking it carefully every single day. Large animals like Elephas antiquus, a forest elephant nearly 13 feet tall, offered huge rewards but came with enormous risk. Hunting something that size with stone tools required teamwork, planning, and a whole lot of courage. The same went for creatures like the megaloceros, the giant deer with antlers stretching up to 12 feet wide, and the aurochs, the wild ancestor of modern cattle. These weren't casual meals, they were full-blown missions. To take them down, early humans relied on a powerful combination of sharpened stone tools, group coordination, and increasingly, fire. Fire wasn't just for warmth, it could flush animals from hiding or protect a camp from nighttime predators. These strategies marked a turning point. Humans were no longer just reacting to nature, they were beginning to control small parts of it. But the relationship between humans and animals wasn't purely physical, it was also emotional, maybe even spiritual. Some animals seem to have been more than just meat. In ancient caves across Europe, we find paintings of giant deer, aurochs, and lions, created with care and detail. These weren't just doodles. They may have been ritualistic symbols of reverence, respect, or even belief. It's possible these creatures were viewed not just as food, but as forces of nature, maybe even early gods. And then there were animals so strange, so massive, they seem to have lived on in memory long after they disappeared. Creatures like Gigantopithecus, the enormous ape of Southeast Asia, have no written records, but their likeness echoes in modern legends like the Yeti or Bigfoot. Could it be that early encounters with these real giants planted the seeds for the myths we still whisper today? Whether through conflict or coexistence, animals shaped how early humans lived, moved, and thought. They challenged us to be smarter, faster, and more connected as a species. But not all of them survived the test of time. Let's explore what led to the disappearance of the giants and what those extinctions reveal about a world on the edge of change. To truly understand the Earth 300,000 years ago, we have to zoom in on the continents themselves. Each region was shaped by climate, isolation, and evolution in unique ways. Life looked very different depending on where you stood, and survival meant something different on every continent. Africa was the heartbeat of early humanity. Savannas stretched for miles full of grazing animals like pelerovis and antelopes. Herds moved with the seasons, and predators followed close behind. It was a dynamic ecosystem, constantly shifting between wet and dry periods. And in the middle of it all, early hominins, like Homo heidelbergensis and the earliest Homo sapiens, learned to live among both danger and opportunity. The open grasslands forced them to adapt, to hunt smarter, and to work together. This wasn't just where we survived. This was where we began. Meanwhile, Europe was locked in the grip of the Ice Age. Much of the continent was covered in tundra, cold, wind-blasted, and treeless, but it wasn't lifeless. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, and saber-toothed cats made this frozen world their home. Early humans migrated through these regions, timing their movements with the climate. When the ice retreated during warmer interglacial periods, forests would return, bringing with them deer, aurochs, and other prey. But survival here was tough. Humans had to battle the elements just as much as the animals. In Asia, conditions were wildly varied. While the north faced ice and cold, the tropics of Southeast Asia were lush and humid, teeming with life. Gigantopithecus, the towering ape, lived in dense forests, feeding on bamboo. Early human dispersals into Asia followed rivers and coastlines, often tracking game or fleeing cold. As rain patterns shifted and forests expanded, new opportunities and new threats emerged. Asia was where diversity exploded, from dry steppes to jungle thickets. The Americas. Across the ocean, North and South America were still isolated. Here, evolution had gone in its own direction. Ground sloths the size of cars lumbered through dry canyons. Creatures like Macrochinia, with camel bodies and trunks, grazed beside armadillo-like giants. Humans wouldn't arrive here until much later, but when they did, they encountered a world full of strange megafauna that had never seen a spear or fire. The result? A dramatic and often deadly clash between species that had evolved apart for millennia. And then there were the islands, Madagascar and parts of Oceania, isolated and untouched. Without large mammalian predators, evolution got creative. Birds like Varambe titan, the elephant bird, grew taller than most humans and heavier than a horse. Turtles like Myelania developed horns and clubbed tails, looking more like armored dinosaurs than reptiles. These animals thrived for thousands of years, until humans finally arrived. With them came fire, dogs, and hunting, and many of these giants didn't survive the encounter. Across every continent, the story was the same at its core: life responding to the land. Whether it was through giant herbivores adapting to dry savannas or predators learning to hunt in the snow, the creatures of the Middle Pleistocene were locked in a constant state of adaptation. But not all adaptations could keep pace with the changes ahead. That ancient world may seem distant, but it shaped everything. It taught our ancestors to think, to work together, and to adapt when the world turned harsh. The tools we use, the fears we carry, even the stories we pass down, all trace back to that era. Its fossils are more than bones. They're signposts on the road to who we became. Today, as we face rising temperatures, shrinking habitats, and mass extinctions, the past doesn't feel so far away. The same patterns that shaped the end of the megafauna are echoing again in new forms. But there's a difference now. We understand what's happening. We can learn from the past, not just repeat it. The Earth of 300,000 years ago lives in our DNA, in our instincts, in the very soil beneath our feet. We are not separate from that world. We are its legacy.